The American Revolution was not won by heroic speeches or flawless victories. It was shaped by chaos, desperation, and battles that nearly destroyed the rebellion before it truly began. Behind the legendary names and famous dates lies a brutal truth. Many of the most important battles were mistakes, miscalculations, and near disasters that could have ended the dream of independence forever. What we remember as a clean fight for freedom was, in reality, a fragile struggle where survival often mattered more than victory, and where defeat came dangerously close to rewriting history. The American Revolution did not begin with confident soldiers marching toward destiny. It began with uncertainty, fear, and a deep imbalance of power. On one side stood the British Empire, the most powerful military force on earth, hardened by global warfare and supported by a professional army and navy. On the other stood 13 divided colonies, bound more by frustration than unity, and defended largely by farmers, merchants, and volunteers with little formal training. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, they were not part of a master plan. They were the result of tension boiling over. British troops marched to seize colonial weapons, colonial militias mobilized in response. What followed was confusion, chaos, and shock, yet those chaotic moments ignited a war that neither side fully expected. The early battles revealed an uncomfortable truth: the American forces were unprepared for a long war. Supplies were scarce. Command structures were weak. Loyalty to the revolutionary cause was far from universal. Many colonists remained loyal to the crown, while others simply hoped to survive without choosing sides. The Battle of Bunker Hill, often remembered as a colonial victory, was in reality a British tactical success. The British took the hill, but at a staggering cost. Their heavy casualties sent a clear message: these colonial militias, though untrained, could stand against professional soldiers. The psychological impact was enormous. It transformed a rebellion into a war of endurance. As the conflict expanded, General George Washington faced impossible decisions. His army was constantly outnumbered, underfed, and underpaid. Desertion was common. Disease killed more soldiers than bullets. Yet Washington understood something crucial: he did not need to win every battle. He only needed to keep the army alive long enough for Britain to grow tired of the fight. The battles that followed, Long Island, Trenton, Princeton, were not grand triumphs but calculated risks. At Long Island, the Continental Army barely escaped annihilation, slipping away under cover of fog. It was not a victory, but it was survival. At Trenton, a daring winter crossing of the Delaware River revived morale, proving that the British were not invincible. These early clashes revealed the true nature of the war: it was not about decisive victories, but endurance, timing, and belief. As fighting spread across the colonies, the war became increasingly brutal. Civilians were caught in the middle. Farms were burned. Towns were divided. Neighbors turned against each other. The Revolution was not just a war between armies, it was a civil conflict that fractured communities and families. In the South, the conflict turned even more vicious. Guerrilla warfare replaced formal battles. Loyalties shifted constantly. British forces attempted to rally Loyalist support but underestimated the resistance they would face. The Southern campaign became a grinding struggle marked by ambushes, reprisals, and widespread suffering. One of the most critical turning points came at Saratoga in 1777. What is often remembered as a decisive American victory was actually the result of British miscommunication and overconfidence. When British General John Burgoyne surrendered his army, it sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. For the first time, European powers believed the American cause might succeed. France's entry into the war changed everything. The conflict was no longer a colonial rebellion, it became a global war. French troops, naval power, and resources shifted the balance, forcing Britain to fight on multiple fronts across the world. Yet even with foreign support, victory was far from certain. The Continental Army endured harsh winters, especially at Valley Forge, where hunger and disease nearly destroyed it. What held the army together was not victory, but persistence, and Washington's ability to inspire loyalty despite constant hardship. The final act came at Yorktown in 1781. Trapped by American and French forces on land and by the French Navy at sea, British General Cornwallis surrendered. It was not the end of the war, but it marked the collapse of Britain's will to continue fighting. The truth about the American Revolution's battles is this: independence was not inevitable. It was uncertain, fragile, and repeatedly on the edge of collapse. Victory came not from flawless strategy, but from endurance, adaptation, and the willingness to continue when defeat seemed inevitable. The revolution succeeded not because the Americans were stronger, but because they refused to stop fighting. The war did not end with Yorktown, even though history often treats that moment as the final chapter. Fighting continued for nearly 2 more years, and uncertainty lingered across the colonies. British forces still occupied major cities like New York and Charleston. Loyalists feared retribution. Patriots worried the fragile alliance with France could fracture. Peace was far from guaranteed. Behind the scenes, diplomacy became the next battlefield. American representatives traveled to Europe, where they faced the enormous challenge of convincing powerful nations that a group of former colonies deserved recognition as a sovereign state. Negotiations in Paris were tense and strategic. The American delegates, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, understood that independence could be won at the negotiating table just as easily as lost on the battlefield. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war. Britain recognized the United States as an independent nation, ceding vast territory east of the Mississippi River. On paper, it was a remarkable victory. But the reality on the ground was far more complicated. The new nation was deeply in debt, politically divided, and uncertain about its future. The American Revolution had proven that a powerful empire could be challenged, but it had not answered the most difficult question: what kind of nation would replace it? The aftermath of the war exposed deep tensions. Soldiers returned home to unpaid wages and broken promises. Farmers faced crushing debt. Loyalists fled or were stripped of property. Native American nations, many of whom had sided with Britain, were pushed off their lands as westward expansion accelerated. For them, the American victory marked the beginning of an even more devastating chapter. Slavery, too, remained unresolved. While the language of liberty echoed throughout the colonies, millions of enslaved people remained in bondage. Some had fought for the British in exchange for freedom, others for the Patriots, and many were left in limbo when the war ended. The contradiction between freedom and slavery became one of the nation's deepest moral failures, a tension that would erupt again decades later. The revolution also reshaped global politics. It inspired revolutions in France, Haiti, and Latin America, proving that empires were not invincible. Yet it also served as a warning: revolution could unleash chaos as easily as liberty. The American example became both a symbol of hope and a lesson in caution. At home, the weaknesses of the new government quickly became clear. The Articles of Confederation created a loose alliance of states with little central authority. Congress lacked the power to tax, regulate commerce, or enforce laws. Economic instability and internal unrest, such as Shays' Rebellion, exposed the fragility of the young nation. These challenges forced a reckoning. In 1787, leaders gathered in Philadelphia to rethink the very structure of American government. What emerged was the U.S. Constitution, a bold attempt to balance power, prevent tyranny, and preserve unity. It was shaped directly by the lessons of the war: fear of centralized authority, fear of chaos, and fear of repeating the mistakes that had led to revolution in the first place. The battles of the American Revolution were not just military clashes; they were moments that defined values, tested ideals, and exposed contradictions. They revealed that freedom is rarely won in a single moment; it is negotiated, contested, and constantly redefined. The truth about the American Revolution's battles is that they did not create a perfect nation. They created an unfinished one. And that unfinished struggle, between liberty and power, unity and division, continues to shape the United States to this day. In the end, the American Revolution was not a clean victory written in bold lines of triumph. It was a fragile experiment born from uncertainty, sacrifice, and contradiction. The battles that shaped it were not only fought with muskets and cannons, but with ideas about freedom, authority, loyalty, and human worth. Every clash on the battlefield echoed a deeper struggle over what kind of nation could emerge from rebellion. What made the Revolution remarkable was not perfection, but perseverance. Against overwhelming odds, a divided collection of colonies held together long enough to imagine something new. Their success did not come from flawless leadership or superior strength, but from endurance, adaptation, and belief in a future not yet defined. Yet the victory carried unfinished business. The ideals proclaimed in independence were not fully realized for millions who lived under oppression. The war created opportunity, but also contradiction. It laid the foundation for liberty while postponing justice for many. In that sense, the American Revolution was both an ending and a beginning, a promise made, but not fully kept. Understanding the truth behind its battles allows us to see history not as a legend carved in stone, but as a living story shaped by human choices. The Revolution did not solve America's problems, it introduced them. And each generation since has been tasked with deciding how those founding ideals should be interpreted, defended, and expanded. The real legacy of the American Revolution is not found only in victory or independence, but in the ongoing struggle to live up to its principles. It reminds us that freedom is never guaranteed, it must be questioned, protected, and earned again and again. That is the enduring truth behind the battles that built a nation.